objectives and plans, because a lot of what you were saying ties in exactly with what I would draw out from COPE's experience, and I'm going to give you that. And then some specific ideas for this possible network, things you might be wanting to do, like the CRC reporting, etc. But also very useful, I will add in an extra point on the question of the review of the Child Care Act, because there are some potentials there that you may not be aware of that you might want to pick up on. So COPE itself, very much like you identified it with this network, it is about having different groups, different individuals, some who are working directly with families and children of prisoners, some who are academics, some who are doing more policy and advocacy kind of work, and bringing those together to identify the issues, share good practices and challenges amongst those COPE members and affiliates. And an example of this was the recent webinar we did on the question of virtual or remote visiting, because this has become such an issue with the restrictions imposed in relation to COVID-19, and in many European countries, the ban therefore on any in-person visits. And also with the networking meeting that we did amongst the COPE members and affiliates, at which Bedford Row talked about their work with Limerick Prison. And that was one of the examples that was highlighted. Again, very much as you've identified for yourselves, the question of joint advocacy. For COPE, this is of course particularly at the European Union, the Council of Europe and the UN levels. And the credibility it gives to be able to say that you're speaking on behalf of a pan-European network with 91 members and affiliates in 31 countries, which actually does make people sit up and listen in a way that if it was just one or two, you wouldn't necessarily get. And that's, for COPE, has included instigating the creation of new standards and actually being involved in the drafting and background work for those standards, and then working for their implementation. And so again, an example of this has been all the work around creating the Council of Europe recommendation on concerning children with imprisoned parents. And one of the particular areas of implementation that COPE is now working on is that it's participating in Europris, the European Organization of Prison and Correctional Services expert group on children with imprisoned parents, a group which itself was created in partnership with COPE in 2019. So you can see how the different things sort of follow on from each other. Let me just pause for a moment to say I'm also going to share with you this presentation afterwards, because I do have specific titles and hyperlinks to various things so that you'll be able to look them up for yourselves. So you don't need to take too detailed notes. Take notes of any questions or comments, however, please. Again, having different members with different expertise means that we can draw on that expertise to produce training materials and what we at COPE very often call toolkits. And some examples of some recent ones are the ones for judges or sentencers, depending on which kind of criminal justice system you have. A media toolkit, which was being done very recently, and a schools toolkit. And again, in my presentation, when you get it, there will be links to all of those which are available on the COPE website. Going back now specifically to the Council of Europe recommendation, COPE has now produced an implementation guidance document. And again, that's on the website. You will get the hyperlink. And in that, COPE has not only gone through and helped to identify who are the different relevant groups for the different provisions in that recommendation, and then also to provide some examples of some good practices. And so that could be a really useful basis for you to then use and adapt in your own context to follow up on that recommendation. I also want to highlight at this point that one of the things that happened last month was that the Council of Europe in fact adopted revised European prison rules, which refer specifically to this Council of Europe recommendation, as well as other things, but also draw heavily on the UN's rules on the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, the Bangkok rules, and the UN's revised standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules. Why these are particularly important, in my view, is because in my experience, most prison inspectors use the European prison rules as their standard reference work. And I used to get very frustrated when those hadn't been revised and we'd got the Bangkok rules on women prisoners, that most of the inspectorates said, but we don't use the UN standards, we use the European ones. So that's why this one, which is very new, is particularly important, and I think does highlight, again, one of the places where, as an Irish network, you might want to be using both the recommendation and the revised prison rules as a publicity tool, as an advocacy tool, talking to the prisons inspectorate, talking to the government departments, talking to the prison authorities. You are aware that there are these revised rules, this is what they bring forward, etc. Just to finish in a sense on a couple of other points, I mean, COPE again has been involved in the advocacy around both the Council of Europe Child Rights Strategy and now with the new European Union institutions, the new European Commission, the new EU Child Rights Strategy. I'd like to also now make another link into something that you might want to follow up on, which I'll come back to, which is the UN's global study on children deprived of liberty. Now, as COPE, we were primarily involved with the chapter that is fairly limited in scope, which was about babies living in prison with a parent. We tried and failed to persuade them to broaden that out to children and prisoners more generally. We also tried, and I don't think really succeeded at all, in getting people to think about in relation to the other, because the other chapters include one on juveniles in detention, but we kept trying to get them to understand that quite often juveniles may also be parents. And that's one of the areas that I personally continue to get frustrated around, that is not thought about very much, and certainly not institutionally. And then also the links with children in alternative care and how they are able to maintain link with an imprisoned parent. And again, we often found that those who are particularly in institutional care were not even considering the possibility that those children might have a parent in prison, let alone how they might maintain contact. So I want to come back to that when we talk about the question of the review of the Child Care Act. So thinking a bit more about the Irish network and your opportunities, I think you've already identified some of the sort of strengths, the sharing of knowing who's out there, working together, drawing on your experience and expertise and your contacts, to identify what your priorities are, who needs to make changes, how you can use your contacts and your resources from your academic research, etc., to make those representations, and also the sharing of the good practices and challenges. I mentioned the COPE implementation guidance document, so maybe just again highlighting the Inspectorate of Prisons, not just government departments, obviously the Ombudsman for Children, the Human Rights and Equality Commission, and the relevant professionals, judges, lawyers, police, prison staff, social workers, etc., etc. I've mentioned the revised European prison rules, so we don't need to go back to that one. Perhaps just worth mentioning in passing before moving on to the UN, that there is some relevant case law from the European Court of Human Rights. And if you're interested in that, for my own reference, I'd actually produced a working document which was updated until March, but there haven't been any relevant cases since March, that actually I just pulled together and did a little bit of analysis of what some of those cases were. So if you would like that, let me know, I can share it with you. To come now to the question of Ireland and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the committee, the UN treaty bodies have had to postpone sessions, and there's delays, and of course they can't have in-person meetings for the same reason that you're not having in-person meetings. So the Irish list of issues prior to reporting is due to be adopted this October at what's called the 87th pre-sessional meeting of the committee. I don't know whether you've or any of you have made submissions already for that list of issues, but if you have, and that was some time ago, you might want to think about whether there's anything more recent you would like to flag for the committee to consider. If you haven't, you might want to consider and check whether it's too late to do a submission, because with this part, the way they've now adapted this system, the committee adopts the list of issues, and the government is then asked to report in relation to those issues, rather than just producing a government report and then the committee asks questions, etc. So this is the first stage before the government is asked to produce its report. And obviously, if there are things you would like the government to be reporting on, if you can get it into the list of issues, that's really useful. I've given you some contacts in the presentation about where to go if you want to find out about doing that kind of a submission. A couple of recent examples from lists of issues prior to reporting. Sweden was specifically asked to explain the measures taken to enable children with parents in prison to maintain personal relations and access adequate support from social services. And then also to provide disaggregated data about children of incarcerated parents. Similarly, Croatia was asked to provide disaggregated data, but very specifically about the number of children whose mothers have been incarcerated. So, and in fact, again, I've given you the link for the government response from Croatia. Sweden hasn't yet got to that stage, it hasn't provided its responses. The list of issues, the session at which it's adopted, the pre-session at which it's adopted, is not a public one, but the list itself is public once it's been adopted. So that means that if there are things you want to publicize from that list, if there's things you want to take up with the government or the Children's Ombudsman or anyone else, you can then use that list of issues to say to the government, you're being asked to report on this. You could, if you feel like it, if it's useful, say, here's some of the places you can, or we could help you to provide information in response to that, or you can use that to wait and see what they respond. You could be reaching out to the Child Rights Coalition to see if others want to be involved, etc., etc. But also, once that list of issues is published, there's no reason for the network not to then go back to the Committee on the Rights of the Child to actually provide supplementary questions. You asked about this, so you could also provide your information in response to what they have asked, which they can then, of course, compare with what the government produces or fails to produce. You can come with supplementary questions, that you would like them to be asking when the actual review takes place next year, no, 2022, isn't it? And also to suggest some possible recommendations. And again, in my experience, as long as you word it tactfully, they're really, really grateful for suggestions of what for you would be really useful recommendations for them to be making to the government. Obviously, when the report of the government is available, that gives you a further opportunity to comment, both within Ireland, taking up issues, media coverage, etc., and also with the committee. And then when the actual session takes place, that is a public session. You can participate remotely. Whether you'll be able to participate in person will depend on the entire world situation by then. But it's also a great opportunity because it is webcast, which means that you can also alert media. You can catch video clips of what the government actually says. So if it makes useful commitments, they can't squeeze out of them afterwards by saying, no, 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 we didn't say that, because you can also always show them, yes, you did, look, we've got it on. And I do know that happened in relation to Germany, to great embarrassment for the then minister in Germany, who was trying to deny that he'd ever said something. But also to just raise that awareness, and then obviously really, really important once the committee adopts its concluding observations to follow up, because the concluding observations are only as useful as they're actually followed up and implemented in country. Two just quick points. One, don't forget that Ireland is also a party to the individual complaints optional protocol. So you could consider at some point whether that's a useful route to take. There's all sorts of issues about how useful that is, but it's worth just having it in mind. And then what I would also like to flag, particularly because of your mention of the review of the Child Care Act, is don't forget that there are also UN guidelines on alternative care in which we did get recognition of children of imprisoned parents or children with an imprisoned parent in those guidelines, and there's some standards in that sense. But also this year should have been a day of general discussion by the Committee on the Rights of the Child on children's rights and alternative care. But because of the problems this year, they've actually postponed that to next year. So you could be thinking about whether that again might be something useful for you to participate in, and I've given you the link for the background document on that. So that's all I would really like to say at the moment, and I'm very happy to have questions, comments, etc. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. So much information and so much for us to think about. And we really appreciate you sharing the document with the hyperlinks. That'll be fantastic. And just on a personal note, the ECHR cases, we'd love to, and I saw Michelle nodding away there around that as well. So we'd love to see the updates on the ECHR cases. That will be fantastic. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions, comments. You can either raise your hand or do it in the chat. Don't be shy. Yep, Larry. Hi, Larry.
Good question there. What does disaggregated data mean?
Rachel, you're
muted. Rachel.
You're muted. Still.
Okay. So it means you can actually see what it says in the document that the committee themselves specifically ask for, but what it means is they don't just want a single number. They want girls, boys, whether different minorities. So again, particularly in the Irish context, that definitely ought to include Roma and travellers. Could be foreign nationals or any other minorities. Might include an age breakdown, etc. So you can see what they specifically say, but again, that's one of the places where if you have views on what it should include, it will be useful to get those to the committee.
And I think data has long been an issue in this area, Rachel. So I think, you know, having that pressure placed, and if that became a common kind of component in the committee, actually asking for that data, putting that pressure on, because we know that actually even getting headline figures is problematic enough, but then drilling down into what that data means in practice on that kind of disaggregated nature it will be really useful. Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why as COPE with the UN working group on children of incarcerated parents, we really pressed the committee and the secretariat to try and get them to include that as a standard question.
That's great. Okay, so we have a question from Alice. Alice saying that she was very interested in what you were saying about young people in alternative care, and could you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Okay, so the question, let me first of all just say it was one of the things that came out in the Bedford Row presentation at our network meeting with Limerick, was that in fact it was children in state care or in alternative care of some sort that Bedford Row was working with around Limerick, and that created a lot of interest. One of the challenges we've had is particularly what we've heard about is the what, let's call it generically, orphanages, although they're not always called orphanages, and as we know, a lot of those in there are not orphans in any sense. That they were not necessarily considering whether there was a linkage in any way between the child in the institution and a parent who was in prison. And that could be because the links could be that the child going into the institution is linked with the parent going into prison. It could be that it's not linked with that at all, or that there's an underlying cause that ended up with the parent in prison and the child in an institution. Now, one of my concerns has always been, and again, interestingly, the one case that is pending and has been pending for far too long before the Committee on the Rights of the Child in this specific area is actually a case against Belgium, which was of an underage, i.e. a child mother, who was a Roma, who was picked up, who was not Belgian, who was picked up in Belgium for an offence. I can't remember specifically, or I'm not sure whether they've told us publicly. She may well have been trafficked, but they didn't consider that. And she had a baby, or she gave birth while she was detained. And they wouldn't let the baby in the prison. So, you know, I mean, in terms of developing case law, I am hoping that when the committee gets around to making its decision, it should give us some really good stuff on a whole range of issues about a child mother, about the links with possible trafficking and around that, with the separation of mother and baby, and what then happens to the baby. Now, I don't know what's happened to the baby in that case, but it's perfectly possible that that child has ended up in some kind of alternative care. It could be that the child has gone to a relative. Not in that case, but another of the Roma cases I was aware of a similar situation. The baby actually ended up with a family member, I think it was an aunt, in a third country, which was neither the country of origin nor the country in which the mother was detained. So we have all sorts of issues going on around children who are in alternative care. one of the main things that we've been trying to do is just awareness raising. Have you considered the possibility that this child that you're caring for, you, the state, in whatever form, whether it's foster care or an institution, or in some cases private institutions, actually has, or NGO-run institutions, actually has a living parent in prison with whom they perhaps should be able to maintain contact? Obviously, best interest of the child, is it in the child's best interest? And again, one of the things that I thought was really interesting that came out from the Bedford Row presentation was the possibility that the social workers in that case, or those running the institutions, may automatically assume it's not in the child's best interest to maintain a relationship with an imprisoned parent. And again, I think this is one of the areas that could really do with a lot more exploration, both academically, but also with the practical experience from Bedford Row and others about what is and isn't, and how you assess that best interest, and how you actually consider whether there is a possible live link, as it were, or potentially activatable link with between a child and a parent.
Yeah, and I think possibly also ideas of good practice in terms of moving forward through that as well. I think it was in the coping research, it was found that children would often be asked and they'd express one view, and that view was then taken as the permanent view of the child, even though perhaps the sentence may be long term and the child may change their mind, but then they're not given that opportunity to change their mind or to even kind of engage with that. So I think there's a lot of possible work and kind of thinking of good practice standards of how to engage with that. That's great, thank you. I see there's been a discussion about